Hello, my name is Adam Evans, and I facilitate the community webinars for ArcXP. We're glad to have you today. Thank you for joining us, and we're excited for the presentation that we have. Before we jump into our content today, just a few housekeeping items. So everyone that's joining is on mute. However, our chat is open. So please, if you have any questions or comments or feedback, feel free to use the chat. We'll be monitoring that and then responding to any questions at the end during our Q&A. So please ask your questions and we will get to them at the end. You're also welcome to ask at the end. And I just wanted to give a little bit of a preview of some of our upcoming webinars. So what we have on the books for the rest of the year, and we'll be sending out more information and advertising in the coming weeks. But in October, we're going to hear from ArcXP's product team about a little preview of what we have left in the roadmap for 2023 going into 2024. So that will be of interest to hear what ArcXP is working on and what we plan to deliver. And then in November, we're planning to hear from one of our tech partners named Plainly. They specialize in generating or AI generated video as a supplement to some of the written content that organizations produce. So it's very innovative, very interesting, and we look forward to hearing from them and how you can also use that tool and functionality. But for now, we are here to talk about AI. So today's session is called Beyond the Hype, Harnessing AI Innovation with ArcXP. And we have with us today Matt Monahan, who is ARC's Chief Technology Officer, and also Joey Marburger, who is the Director of ARC Labs. And ARC Labs, I'm sure they'll go over it, but ARC Labs is really the sort of the innovation arm of ArcXP and is doing fun and exciting things. So Matt and Joey, I will hand it off to you, and we will be back for a Q&A at the end. So Matt.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam. And thanks everybody for joining today. Like Adam said, I'll try to keep this so it doesn't take up the whole time, and then we'll leave some time for questions at the end, including some of the work that Joey and his team have been working on, as well as kind of our core product team. There we go. So we'll jump right in. So I know we've got a lot of folks on the phone. I was just looking through the attendee list quickly, and I see people from kind of customers and partners around the world. And I see people from all kinds of different teams within our customers, the content side, development, product. And so one thing I think that's helpful to do is start out a little bit with kind of the baseline of what we're talking about with AI. You know, I think Joey and I were talking just before this presentation, and one thing that I think is true is in the last year and a half or so, there's been some really amazing applications that have entered the marketplace, leveraging in general what we would call AI. And for a lot of folks who haven't paid very, very close attention to the space, it probably seems hugely disruptive. It's really exciting to see. And a little bit, it feels like it's coming out of nowhere, but there's finally some applications that really bring this category of technologies to the mainstream. And so it's a little bit easier to sort of imagine what it can do. But part of what I hope we can do here at the beginning is just sort of set a baseline for what we're really talking about. And so, you know, the broadest kind of circle of software, applied math, and technologies that we're talking about here, artificial intelligence, is really just a general overall umbrella category for a bunch of different specific subsets of mathematical models and software. And so within what you generally call AI, you've got machine learning, where we use sort of statistical models to try to, as you see, enable machines to improve with experience. They use training sets to improve the model. And then within there, you've got even a subset called deep learning. And so when we're talking about Gen AI and things like ChatGPT, we're looking at very much a small subset of overall AI. And that's what's really changed things. And so very specifically, what most folks are talking about today when they're talking about AI aren't many of the ML models that have been out there for quite a bit of time, many of which are very specific to certain problem sets and industries. A lot of what the focus on today is what you call transformer models. And over here, you basically see the white paper, the research paper that sort of kicked this all off back in 2017. And you'll look and see who authored most of this. It's a lot of folks at Google. So this came out of research inside of Google now almost 7 years ago. And a lot of the models that you see today, things like GPT-4 or DALL-E, these are built on transformer models, all deriving from this research. And so what we call generative AI is really transformer models, and the models behind them are what we call large language models. So when you hear the term LLM, that's what we're talking about. Something like ChatGPT is an application built on an LLM. And so if you look across the industry space and the problem sets that LLMs and Gen AI are intended to solve, it's actually really, really wide. We've heard from a few customers who sort of use Gen AI and something like ChatGPT interchangeably, but actually something like ChatGPT is a very small subset of this problem space. And even that specific example, ChatGPT, is one specific model and application out of many in just even the problem space of specifically text, like you see here. Alongside this, you've got use cases for automated code generation, image generation, automated speech synthesis, video and 3D modeling, and then other very industry and problem-specific applications. And then behind those applications, there's many different possibilities of models. One of the questions you can pose to Joey when we get to the end is some of our experience with some of these different specific models, even just with text. There's significant differences between them in the training sets that they use and the type of data that they can produce with accuracy. And it does take some experimentation to become familiar with those things. The point of this is it's a very, very broad space. And one thing that I think is kind of fun about this chart is the diagram that you see here. And then there was a blog post that went along with it. Sequoia Capital basically produced this with one of their teams, and it's all created by AI. The diagram as well as kind of the information around it. So that's a bit about the problem space and the technology. And the fact is the space is exploding. When I presented this previously, I used a different version of a chart like this. And even then it was a little bit smaller. The investment in the AI space, and again, a lot of it is really around Gen AI and large language models, is exploding. There's more spend, obviously, than any year in the past, but it's also growing at a nonlinear rate. It's growing almost exponentially. We're still very much in the early parts of that hype cycle with a lot of investment flowing in, a lot of VC money flowing in, and some applications that very likely won't pan out. But within this space, you both have folks focusing on the platform part of the problem, as well as very application specific, AI tools and SaaS applications that are targeted towards different industries. And it's not really just an explosion in total investment or in the types of companies focusing on this problem. There's a technology part of this too. So most folks are probably familiar with Moore's Law, and the idea that there's sort of some fundamental limitations in predictable growth on things like computing power. There's similar models that you can apply to things like growth and storage technologies. There's another arms race going on right now, and it's around the training sets and the models that are being used to power these platforms. And a lot of them you're probably familiar with. You might have heard of the different versions of GPT, 1, 2, 3, now 4. And as each of the large platform companies starts working on their own LLMs, you'll see the development pace speed up basically there as well. And this is happening at an enormous rate. You can see here it's an over 15,000x increase in basically 3 years' time to the end of 2022. So it's an enormous amount of growth. It's tough to really explain the impact of this. Again, for most consumers and for most folks outside of the specific AI industry, what you see is basically applications emerging that make it more comprehensible. Behind the scenes, though, what's going on is a race to make these models ever more powerful and well-trained. And so you can look at just kind of the y-axis here, the scale on computing resources used to train these models, and then the benchmark tests over here for these various different models over time. It's growing at a nonlinear rate. And it's driving a huge race on the hardware side to deliver the computing power to train these models. You can see their NVIDIA stock way, way up. They're one of the main providers of chips powering these training models. And the companies that are focused the most on this are provisioning tons of computing resources, which at some point is becoming the fundamental limitation for how quickly these models can scale out. And so even with that all said, again, we are kind of in the hype cycle right now. So if you look across just a few of those problem spaces that we looked at earlier, a few of the different workloads, And here we are kind of in mid 2023. There's definitely some workloads where we're in the kind of production phase of this, and you're seeing some of the early startups that began emerging in this space having some actual business success, growing revenue, growing adoption among customers, and they've got some use cases that are well nailed down. For some of the other workflows, it's much too early. And so for text, there's already some maturity with specific problem sets among things like copy editing, fine-tuning content, editing content. But obviously, for anyone who's spent some time experimenting and playing with these applications and models, there's a long way to go in creating content from scratch, as well as problems like accuracy, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. That being said, if you look for just a couple of years, if you look at the pace of development of LLMs over the past 3 or 4 years, one can pretty easily predict that the quality is going to get better much faster than people are imagining. And so I do think there's something sort of different about this hype cycle and this type of technology than what folks might have seen or witnessed in the past, with some hype cycles that maybe felt a little bit ephemeral, like blockchain, and ones that didn't, like mobile development or cloud computing. One can predict that with LLMs and with generative AI, this is going to continue to accelerate, and the quality of these things will be noticeable even to casual observers, getting better over the course of months and years. And so then here's that hype cycle. If folks aren't familiar with that term before, I mean, you can kind of guess from the name what it refers to. Gartner publishes this sometimes, and they sort of place different technologies and industries on this cycle. And, so we're sort of at this point where expectations are super high for AI. And there's definitely almost a little bit of naivete in the industry, especially media, where people think, okay, it feels very close to home. It's going to replace everything we're doing. And obviously, as people spend more time experimenting with the technology, and that'll be one of the key topics today, they're realizing what some of the limitations are, both with these models overall and these models in their current incarnation. So you can predict that what's going to happen, and I would argue, this is maybe a little bit old. We're probably kind of coming down the other side of this, peak of inflated expectations, where people are starting to realize, okay, you can't just roll these directly out to your audience and your customers. You can't just create content without editing it. There's real limitations to what these models are capable of today. And it's, it's sort of inherent in how they're built and what they do. But obviously that realization is coming around a little bit belatedly to folks in the industry that maybe were less close to this throughout its actual development, among some of the folks in the data science industry. That being said, it'll be tempting, I think, in this period here to sort of pay a little bit of less attention to what's going on. There'll be some initial experiments that won't pan out, and then people might shift their attention to something else. And I think part of the point here today is that would be a mistake. There's going to be another side to the cycle where these production use cases really start to make a difference in the industry. And, the companies that spend time investing in experimentation today are going to be the ones who will accrue benefit when they're ready to take advantage of as the technology matures. One other way to look at the potential impact of this, if you look at total factor productivity over the last 10 years, especially, or sorry, I should say on like a trailing 10-year basis, what's true actually is that total factor productivity has been relatively consistent for about the past 30 years now, since the main introduction of computing technology in the workplace. So certainly, I think for the average person in the workplace, it feels like there's more and more going on. There's more work to do. But it's also true that on an economic basis, it's not leading to higher productivity. And there hasn't been a fundamental change that's really changed that equation. Even the introduction of things like mobile devices in the workplace haven't really nudged these figures significantly. So the investment that's taking place in this industry is a little bit of recognition of the fact that for a lot of investors, it's the next big bet about what might actually open up additional productivity. I didn't include it here. There's actually some early metrics backed. MIT just completed a study and published a paper about it, looking at productivity across workplaces in 3 different industries, I believe. And the results of that was basically a 14% increased productivity. And what they were using was just average workers armed with publicly available generative AI tools, using it for things like drafting papers, drafting emails, other types of written content and presentations, and they were already kind of seeing improvement. And you have to imagine that's some of the most basic examples of what's going to be possible here. So, behind this, expectations are pretty high. Today, obviously, less than 1% of online content created using AI. And some of the venture capital firms that are investing in this space, they're expecting things like within the next 10 years, 50% of online content generated by or augmented by AI. Obviously, for those of us on the call, a lot of our business is creating content. And so I think we kind of read a little bit deeper into these words. This is obviously investors, and they're investors that are hyping up the space that they're heavily investing in. And, I think it's the right thing to sort of wonder, what does that mean 50% will be generated by AI? Does that mean completely from scratch? Does it mean edited by AI? Is it assisted? And probably a lot of us on the call are the ones who are going to have to start creating the answers to that. But I don't think it means probably everything is getting created from scratch. There's other technology that's going to have to develop to actually bring sort of factual information to the content that's getting generated here. Still, I think the future looks more like this than it does like 1%. And if you put this on a timeline comparable to the emergence of other major technology shifts, like smartphone adoption, like cloud computing adoption, you can see that these types of changes often take as much as a decade. And, here we are, obviously, from a technical and a research perspective, this is now about 6 years old, generative AI and large language models, transformer functions. From a commercial perspective, we're probably just a couple of years into it. So there's a long way to go before you see adoption of this really take off. Okay, so that's the background. So hopefully for folks who've been hearing about AI in the space, but maybe there's some folks on the call who hadn't spent a lot of time really running that down to root and thinking about, what does it mean? Why are people talking about AI now? How is this different from previous experiments that a lot of companies, including ArcXP, have done with things like machine learning in the past? That hopefully explains a little bit of the difference between them, where it came from and where the investment is actually going. So if you look at some real world examples, we went out and looked among our customer base as well as others in the industry. And there's some applications, very specific workloads that from our perspective are basically already past the hype cycle. They're somewhere now in the phase of optimizing, sort of looking inside those workloads and trying to build a little bit more fidelity to them. But we're seeing things like channel specific content, things like social posts and headlines, already being used in production with a relatively high degree of quality. AI assisted graphics and diagrams. So obviously this is pretty different than image generation, but there's already relatively good quality for taking raw content like text or other images and then using it to create graphics and diagrams. So I think that's pretty exciting, especially for a lot of folks on this call. Drafting content for speeding time to market. So things like scripts for the broadcasters who are on the phone, stories, initial draft content, which obviously needs editing and needs to be sort of fine-tuned in order to be published, especially content that can be pretty well templatized. Things like press releases are already really well optimized for these types of applications. And there's specific companies and startups that are solving for those individual use cases. Turnkey content at scale. This one's kind of interesting, and I show an example of where this sometimes goes wrong. But this is content that typically follows a certain format, and it's difficult to do with human labor and human resources at the scale that the use case demands. So I'll show an example about sports coverage a little bit later on this presentation. Financial reporting is another one. Cases where you want to create content in a different form, like diagrams or written analysis from raw data sets. And the one that we've seen a number of our customers, I think at least 6 or 7 customers working on, is translations of content. That's an area where the technology's improved significantly to the point where the translations are actually pretty good. Obviously, most of our customers are still choosing to do some sort of human review of that content before publishing, although not all. And then finally, we're mostly focused on content here, but assisted code completion or project setup, code creation. That's something that our customers are already making use of. Some of the technology partners that we work with in ARC have those built into their platforms, and it's something that we're working on too. On the right-hand side, you can see some examples of some of the companies that are emerging in the space or the products that are emerging in the space that can help you sort of make use of these technologies and apply them to your everyday work. So just going a little bit deeper with this, copy editing, editing for style, it's sort of funny. A lot of our customers we see working on experiments for content creation at the beginning of the process. And what they sort of conclude is that, it's very difficult to have the content be factual, especially in the industry that many of the folks in this call are in. Um, Large language models are not well suited for discerning facts. That's not kind of the main purpose of them. They're much closer to sort of statistical models that can sort of predict what the next word or the next sentence is likely to be. They're less likely to be able to understand. I mean, they're not likely because it's not what they're built for, to be able to understand the actual meaning of the content or its factual nature. But having said that, there are elements of workflows that many of our customers perform that are well suited to that type of automation and optimization. And so many of our customers, have teams or processes for things like copy editing or editing for style. And in those cases where you're not trying to sort of discern fact, except for obviously steps like fact checking, large language models are actually really well suited for the job. This here is an example from Semaphore of some experiments they were running. There's a good article about their work doing this, and it's also kind of interesting because even in the course of them writing the story about this, the model changed, and it was like no longer able to perform this at the end. But in this example, you can see they basically asked it to copy edit a story that they had written, and it did so successfully. In fact, in this case, even correcting some factual errors. Like you can see they basically stated that Ron DeSantis was the governor of Miami. Of course, he's the governor of Florida. And, the language model was able to correct that. Obviously, if you understand how the technology works, you know that it's not correcting it based on some knowledge about the actual facts. It's correcting it based on its predictive capabilities about, the words Florida and Governor Ron DeSantis together. And then on the right-hand side, you can see it editing for style, which I think is probably a case that feels a little bit closer to home for folks. That's something where a lot of times we think that's more of a creative exercise, that teams and copy editing groups would work on. But these language models are actually very, very well suited to do it. And so you can see a few examples there of taking what started out, I believe, as a Reuters piece and then turning it into the style of the New York Times or the New York Post or Fox News. And it actually does a pretty good job of emulating those three styles. Translations of content, I mentioned that we have a number of customers who are doing this already. And some of this began even in early 2022. So you see an example there from Le Monde, the French newspaper, which wanted to expand into North America and started running a digital English language edition. There's obviously other challenges with this too. This requires review, by humans in most cases. And so a number of the publishers, both non-customers and customers of ARC that have done this, have sort of realized the limitations of these types of experiments because you do typically need to pair humans, with that automated content process, unless you look at specific use cases and types of content where you feel comfortable that you don't have to. And so those are the types of questions that our customers are kind of asking themselves, and they come to us on advice with. The good news is the models around this are getting better. And so, again, this is something Joey can speak to a little bit more later in the call, but it's true that not all of these language models are the same. They're trained and optimized for different specific problems. And so there's a subset of LLMs that are specifically optimized for translations. And Facebook or Meta recently released their own model, Seamless M4T, specifically optimized for speech and text translations. So these models are getting better all the time. And what that means, I think, for customers that have done experiments with things like translations in the past is those experiments are never finished. The space is rapidly evolving. And so, I would definitely recommend for customers that maybe did these experiments in the past, try again with some of the new models. You'll probably see improved results. This is one Joey shared with me, and it's a good point. So when you think about the use cases for this, most folks have probably at least seen a little bit about things like automated code generation or project setup. I won't spend a ton of time on that here. They've probably also seen the case of job titles for things like prompt engineer, prompt writing, content creator. And it's sort of an interesting space where today, where these models are at, how you ask it to do something and the types of questions you sort of pose to it will help determine the quality of the response that it gives back to you. Now what you're seeing is cases where folks are using large language models to actually create the prompts for another large language model. And this is something Joey and the ArcXP Labs team have actually done as part of some of the experiments we're doing. So he can speak a little bit to what that's like. But this is just kind of an interesting piece, explaining how other engineers have been doing the same thing. So the part about this that a lot of our media customers always ask about is sort of, what about concerns about quality? What about concerns about attribution? In the industry, obviously you see a lot of interest around those questions. You can see here's the Conference on Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency. The submissions to them increasing dramatically in the years corresponding basically with the release of this technology. I'd expect that to continue. And then, this, you could ask sort of how they were measuring it, but I would expect these things to increase dramatically too. The technology is becoming more pervasive. And there's probably a piece of this where it's also becoming more convincing. And so I think the closer you get to kind of that uncanny valley where it sort of seems like what humans would create, but not exactly, the more you'll sort of experience discomfort among your audience and your readers if you don't get it exactly right. At ArcXP, we've got a bunch of experience with our customers, also the Washington Post, for kind of where we emerged with this question of what are the best practices around labeling content, attributing content, how to let people know where generative AI is involved. The short answer is, at this point, it's really important to make it transparent to your audience. And, within, for instance, the design team on the Washington Post side of things, they spent a lot of time thinking about how that labeling looks, how to make it obvious to our readers when we're using that technology. If you look across the best industry examples of this, you'll see that transparency and visibility too. So it's really important to consider in the design and the product design cycle. The piece about the feedback for generative AI that I think is maybe the easiest to sort of get out of the way is, can we just automatically create content and have it write stories? And the fact is, this is sort of fraught with a lot of problems. CNET, announcing earlier this year that they had a bunch of AI generated content, they ultimately had to pull back because it contained factual errors. That last step of automatically publishing content without sort of human review can be really challenging, because the fact is these models are not built for fact checking. They're not built for sort of introducing new factual content. That's not what they're for. They're for predicting language. And so I think to the extent that sometimes when folks are thinking about doing more experiments with language models and there's some objection to it, if it's because of this, I think it's sort of important to move past that objection and think about how to sort of put review process around it so you can continue with the experimentation that's necessary to learn about this. This was a case of, this was just earlier this week, a publisher who had some sports content that was being automatically generated. I think it's also important for all of us as sort of industry practitioners and professionals to distinguish between previous generations of what you call AI or machine learning and generative AI. If you look at the specific example, I didn't put the specific publisher that was doing this, but obviously folks can kind of go look it up and the firm behind it. Some of these things aren't necessarily generative AI. You can see in this example below, it was sort of templated content. And so we should all be asking the question, what's the difference between using a model not for its intended purpose and a simple software defect? And those are difficult problems that I think our customers are going to have to grapple with as this technology gets further introduced. Shifting topics a little bit, slightly different way of looking at this. This is a question that we get a lot from our customers. Some version of this is generative AI ready for prime time? Should we be using large language models now? And so the point here is really to think about experimentation. The question that we always encourage our customers to be asking is my company and team ready for this technology shift? Not is the technology ready for us? So let me explain a little bit more about that. There's the statement, the future is always boring when we get there. And folks might have seen this type of kind of visualization before. Every time there's a major technology shift, you could think about, the original personal computer and the internet, or the mobile internet as popularly adopted. You get really amazing emergent examples of that technology as you get towards the end of that technology shift. In between, you have this feeling that innovation is dead. We've gone as far as we can possibly go with this technology. What possibly could come next? And the next major technology shift actually feels a little bit behind. So today, what's happening with LLMs might not feel totally compelling, especially if you find out the details about how it works. You might think it's not really capable of some of the best examples of user experiences and mobile applications that are out there today. But the reality is at the end of these technology shifts, there's going to be a dramatic change. And if you go back to that example of, sort of those emergent use cases that come out of that transformative technology, that question of the future is always born when we get there, the key thing to remember is except for the industries that were disrupted in that change. And so, leaving this sort of vague and abstract statement aside, the question that I think all of us who are in the media industry should be asking is, what's the company that's coming to disrupt mine going to look like? How are they going to solve this problem? And so, back to that first question of is generative AI ready? How should we be using it? The key here and what I think our customers who sort of have the most experimental nature are doing today is they're spending a lot of time just building experiments. They understand that many of them might not pan out. And what they're doing is they're learning and building competency inside their teams. And for the companies that do this the best, what this picture shows is the only question they're asking is, hey, if I try this experiment, if I make this change, is it sort of a one-way door or is it a two-way door? And one-way doors aren't always obvious. If you destroy the quality on your publication by sort of introducing a bunch of technology without supervision, that could easily be a one-way door for you, right? You destroy the reputation of your brand and it's impossible to sort of move backwards, very, very difficult to recover it. But there's a lot of ways you can design experiments without that fundamental risk, that are two-way doors. And, so then I think the other question that, our customers should ask of themselves is, what's our true value proposition? A lot of the use cases, and many of the ones you even saw earlier, they tend to be sort of internally focused. If you think of the typical media company content workflow, there's probably some form of creating primary source content, photos, videos, interviews, raw transcripts. Those get edited, they get curated, they get fact-checked. Then there's some creating of actual consumer content, writing an article, creating a finally edited video piece. That will get edited, fact-checked before it's released again. There's probably some final check, copy editing, editing for style, production, distribution, and curation. If you look at the ones that are highlighted here in red, those are the cases where already large language models can start to solve these problems. So when you think about what my company does, and you're thinking of any of these steps, my company writes stories, my company writes scripts, they create videos. What I'd urge you is when you're developing these experiments, think of your audience, because the reality is a lot of these examples, these will get edited out, these will get automated. And the question will really shift to what you do the best and what your audience wants to see. I'll skip ahead a little bit. I want to leave some time for questions. What do users want? These are the types of questions that we do in some workshops with our customers, especially around Gen AI, thinking about when do they want content? What type of content are they looking for? And once you get through these, you start thinking about new things that new content forms that we could be experimenting with, personalized content. And so we have some ideas about that we've been working on within the labs team and within our core teams. If you look forward through 2030, some predictions that we see in the industry and that our team is looking forward to. One is that when it comes to written content, this isn't about the value of written content, but it does refer to the cost of written content. And we can sort of predict that the cost of creating that written content is going to bit by bit get driven down to near zero. It doesn't mean that we won't have folks in our teams who are responsible for doing things like reporting and fact checking and gathering information. It does mean that the creation of that content over several years' time is going to become very, very cheap to produce. Content forms and user experience for consuming content will almost definitely shift. For the majority of customers who are on this webinar and who work with ArcXP, there is a fundamental idea of creating a single piece of content that goes out to their entire audience. That the audience basically consumes this mass created piece of content in a singular form. And what AI and what generative AI and large language models specifically will change for our audience and for us in the industry is the ability to create differentiated pieces of content that are segmented by your audience or even personalized for them. There's already startups and investment for competitors to news companies that can create personalized news content. Obviously, a lot of that today is lacking in quality, lacking in fact checking. The fact is, though, there's companies out there that are experimenting with this user experience and the technology today. And that is something that I think, those of us in the media industry should be a little bit aware of and maybe preparing for. Sports, as well as live video, you can basically predict the value that's going to increase exponentially. You can't replicate it, and there's a high demand for it. Advertising will be hyper-personalized. This is happening also because of the shift towards first-party data. And so you can predict that we're going to be able to, or we're going to need to be able to create hyper-personalized content for users and user segments. And then finally, for the engineers and developers on the team, I think this will happen much sooner than 2030. Every developer will become an AI-assisted developer. It'll happen in small ways at first within your IDE, with projects that you use, but over time you can predict that those workflows will become more and more automated. So for the engineers who are experimenting with AI, they're not immune from the potential impact of this. It's going to be happening to them too. So just the last few things, I know folks are curious, what are we working on inside ArcXP? And so there's a few examples here I want to share. And then again, I want to leave some time for questions. Joey can talk a little bit more about some of the things we've been working on. One of the things that folks will see the soonest, which is coming out to beta in the coming weeks, is a new AI Chrome extension that will live alongside all of our tools. And so what we're trying to do here is bring within our content creation tools, small capabilities that will make the creation of that content, the editing of that content, and the production of that content as easy as possible. We've gotten a lot of great feedback from customers, several of whom I see here on the phone today, about some of these workflows and where we can help. Joey and his team inside ArcXP Labs have spent a ton of time kind of experimenting with ways to make this easier, thinking really about the prompts that you have to ask to produce good recommendations. And there's also the possibility within this user experience to do things that are a little bit more freeform. And so this will be something that we'll be releasing to customers and then getting some feedback from. And hopefully this can drive future learnings that will go deeper into our products. And so you see some examples of how this is going to appear. Recommended actions based on the application that it appears in the application page, so it's aware of the rest of the ArcXP suite. Possible features to allow freeform text to ChatGPT, and then recent prompts. The other side of this, as we mentioned, is, we're really focused on making sure that these experiments with generative AI aren't just about content creation or making the editorial process easier. We also need to focus on our audience and on our users. So there's a bunch of use cases that we've seen sort of popularly adopted among our customers and in the industry. And as usual, we're trying to bring those back into Page Builder and into themes. And so first, as an experiment from labs, we'll be looking at some potential AI blocks. Ultimately, these will make it into our final product. But the idea is that, as with the rest of Page Builder and the rest of the theme suite, we want to make it as easy as possible for our customers to adopt some of these more widely popularized uses of large language models in a turnkey way. And then there's longer term kind of investment that we're looking at within our product team. This is going a little bit further out into next year and beyond. And so here we have a few things in progress. One, we're talking to industry partners within Google, within Meta, and thinking about how we can sort of better negotiate some of the model processors to ensure that our content's recognized and attributed correctly. We know that, within our customer base, there's customers who've been negotiating together and trying to figure out how they can sort of work with the platform providers to do this. This is something that we want to be able to help with. We have the connections in the industry to assist our customers with this, and we're actively in those conversations. A corresponding part of that problem is looking at our data model and making sure that we have the metadata where we can do that appropriately so that there's no technology hurdles to solving some of those problems with the platform providers. And then I mentioned this earlier, there's going to be some experimentation coming up next year looking at content personalization. If you've listened to any of our roadmap presentations within ArcXP, you've probably heard our focus on audience segmentation and personalization. And we see LLMs and generative AI playing a role there. In particular, we're looking further out into the future and thinking about a time where content might actually be segmented or personalized, by the audience that you're speaking to, including sometimes where, as the technology improves, it may not all be sort of either human generated or even human edited. And so finally, the other side of this is there's a bunch of primary source content that our customers produce that we know is going to become really, really important over time. The more we automate the content creation process, the more it's going to be very, very important to maintain your library of primary source content properly attributed, properly tagged, and ready to be used for content creation, including in automated form. And so we're thinking really hard on the asset management side of things to make sure that things like interview notes, transcripts, live video, and raw video are being managed properly as potential inputs into that content creation process. So that's a little bit about where our thoughts are around generative AI, language models, what we're doing inside of ARC, some of the examples we're seeing from our customers. Hopefully folks appreciated hearing a little bit about that today. And then definitely now I want to open it up to questions about what we're doing, about what our customers are doing, what we're seeing in the industry. We're happy to answer anything. Joey's joining me on the phone here as well. So thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And yeah, everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and post them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. We do already have some questions coming in, Matt and Joey, so I'm going to jump right in. Brian asks, as more and more major media companies block robots like GPT-bot from ingesting their content, how would the lack of these sources of credible information affect the development of AI-generated content?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one thing that I didn't cover in my presentation, that's something that we've been experimenting with also, and I'll probably flip it over here to Joey to talk a little bit more about, is how sort of these public LLMs will be extended over time. And, you know, Joey and I have spoken a little bit about this, that probably for most of these B2B use cases, you know, for companies like any of ours that are on the phone, it's not going to be common over time to be using just publicly available models for many of the workloads and use cases that you'd be using generative AI for. So Joey, maybe you could talk just a little bit about how you think about sort of model extension, fine tuning, and some of the early work that we've already done there, because I think that probably answers the question of how you can take what's basically still private data to ensure that the models speak to the use case that, you know, our customers want to use.
Yeah. So yeah, I think more and more people will be blocking Scraper. But what you can do is do fine tuning beyond the models that are already out there. You can do them as your own private and custom model. And that's beyond OpenAI. You can do that with pretty much any service. But I think kind of longer term outside the AI, like actual technical space, I think you'll see deals, partnerships happening, where, you know, OpenAI may say like, oh, these certain things are blocked, so we'll strike a deal with X, you know, content company to do something, or maybe it's a subset. There's still a lot of information out there. I'm sure they can still be pretty well trained, even if, you know, New York Times or the Post, whoever is blocking the crawler. But I think the maybe larger question or fear that I've thought about a bit is what happens when it starts getting trained on AI generated content, and it starts like this kind of loop almost, where it's like, you know, the quality can kind of maybe go into like a stasis mode. So that's, I think, something that a lot of AI engineers will be thinking about in the future. But yeah, I think the private models are where people will go in the short term, and something we're working on. So you could have like a custom model on top of another model on like a per customer, per site, per organization basis.
And then we got quite a few questions about the AI functionality that you showed some screenshots of, and I saw Joey, you answered them in the chat, but go ahead and maybe you can talk a little bit about, we got questions about what languages will this be available in, when will it be available, that sort of thing. Maybe could you just give an overview of some of that functionality and when you see it coming?
Yeah, so the extension, which is kind of the byproduct of the product we've really been working on, which is AI API, that'll be behind Trident, and has all sorts of kind of extra functions to it, like tuning prompt, switching between different models, features like maybe how certain things are formatted. But the extension is kind of the face of that. It'll be available in every language, be fully localized. The AI basically knows the language it's in. So if it's an article in French, then it would respond in French unless you use the open prompt and say, summarize this in English. Yeah, I work for Spanish, Korean, Japanese, Portuguese, you name it. And we have kind of these shortcut features that are the kind of top buttons like summarize or translate or identify keywords, tags. And those behind that are the kind of very fine-tuned prompts that we've created for it. But then there's this open prompt, but it's always using the story as context. And in context with the AI, we're also like framing it, that it's a news situation, like basically not to go outside of what it's being given, to avoid it returning incorrect information or hallucinating in any way. Right now, starting with OpenAI, but we're going to bring Llama 2 to it, as well as Bedrock, which we've already been working on, that are basically just as good. OpenAI is just a little bit better at some things. Timing, we're pretty much wrapped it up now. We're about to start the kind of full beta testing over the next couple weeks. And then we'll be sharing more information about rolling it out. It'll be through a key through us, but then as we talk to customers about using it, we can switch the different models. If you want to use your own API key for it, you could. Then we want to hear what new features that people would like. Then after that, we'll be moving more toward the custom trained models and page builder blocks.
Awesome. And then Joey, I think this question's for you as well. Has Arc Labs looked into AI generated audio or video summaries from text and photos?
Yes, and we've actually done that experiment. We have kind of a thing to the side at the moment, deciding where it's going to go, and that is automatic closed captioning for videos. We've actually essentially built a service. We're just not sure if it'll be native integration of Video Center first. Eventually, probably would be, or if we'll test an extension. For photos and video are really hard overall. So like generating photos and videos, all these just not quite there. Probably seen all the 6-7 finger people and whatnot. For audio, that's actually existed for quite a while. We have done some tests with Poly, but that's starts to get into territory of not AI, of this kind of full service behind it. It's something on our roadmap that we're thinking about, that we're as the labs team trying to think about the more advancements in AI. So what is maybe new with text to speech or speech to text, but we are paying attention to it, but it's not a totally planned feature at this point.
Hey Joey, one question I have for you that I'll seed into here is, as you've done some work with some of the different public models that are out there, what are some of the differences that you've seen?
So, well, first off, everybody's catching up with everyone in near real time. OpenAI is probably largely the best, mainly for documentation, usage, and kind of overall quality. But Llama 2, which got a big upgrade the past few weeks, it's really just as good. And best thing about it is you can privatize the model. You'll also be able to do that with OpenAI. They just announced a couple things with enterprise licensing is coming, and their new version of fine-tuning related to GPT 3.5 Turbo. But Llama 2, you can run outside OpenAI. You can run in Hugging Face or AWS and have largely complete control over it. So it no longer is essentially a third-party vendor. The model's open source. So that's why we're looking at that a lot. Bedrock, also really good. But best thing about Bedrock is you can switch between the LLMs that it's using, and it's within AWS, so it speaks to other AWS services really well. And Claude's very good. We've looked at a bit. It's just a little bit more costly. But these are all of the models I've mentioned are the ones that we look to bring to the extension to be swapped out either by choice by us to say this is the best model for this feature, or as a customer, you can say, we only want to use Llama 2.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of the key point is, to the extent that customers are also doing their own experimentations with these technologies, there is differences between even these public model providers, let alone the question of, to what extent they allow you to fine tune, or they're open source, and then you can obviously incorporate your own data.
Great. Another question here is regarding the potentially native AI blocks on Page Builder, are you planning to use a specific LLM, or can the client customize and connect their preferred transformer, Claude rather than ChatGPT? The LLM premium subscriptions would be handled server side and added to for a fee, or client managed.
So still a little early days on it, but our plan, as I mentioned before, is the API powering the extension. Essentially would also power the page builder blocks. So you'd have similar functionality of being able to craft different prompts, select different model, and potentially use your own service or add on your own custom model on top of it. That's something we're actually incubating right now, is just the workflow to create the private fine-tuned model, and then what the system looks like for a customer to be like, I want to use my fine-tuned model. So like a world could be like, say the extension, everybody gets essentially the same extension, but customer A may not have a fine-tuned model and just uses it out of the box. Customer B may be like, I have a fine-tuned model, and that we can layer on top of the extension. So then like the summaries feel a little more toned to, your content writing. The tags are aligned with the tags you normally use, stuff like that. So it all kind of lumps together. Extension is just kind of the kind of quick layer that we can use to get it out there. And then for page builder, a lot of those things would be kind of automated as you're, say, putting things on the page, you can see it. And also starts to get into the really leveraging custom models to do things like related content, related links, automatically recommending a video if there's no video, stuff like that.
For sure. All right, I know we're 5 minutes from the top of the hour and we have several more questions to get through. So just a reminder, we are going to go through all the questions and answer them for the sake of the recording. If you need to hop, no worries. But the next question is there a link to one of the roadmap presentations on personalization? Are we sharing that?
I think, yeah, we do have a presentation we share with customers, not specifically just focused on personalization, but focused on a product roadmap overall. Mike Holland, who's our head of product, and his team put that together. It incorporates the elements that come from Arc XP Labs as well. And, for the folks on the phone who are customers of ours, they can talk to their account manager. And, in our next CPR, we can go through that presentation with them.
Great. Michael asks, will we have a page builder AI block for audio article summary?
Potentially. I think several customers have done audio articles either via power-ups or other services. So it might be something we can replicate over. But I spoke about audio a little bit ago. It's a little bit separate from kind of the generative space, but it's definitely something that we can look at.
Great. Vivek asks, what are the data governance models and compliances in place for the generative AI tools?
I can answer briefly. So that's actually why we haven't pushed out the beta extension quite yet, as we are defining that small piece of contract right now. Because essentially it's going through a third-party vendor that we'll share more on soon. But the one thing I speak to is OpenAI, and I'm not sure many people know this. OpenAI's terms of service, if you're using the API, anything you send to it will not be used for training and will not be stored in any way. But if you're using ChatGPT, it is stored and is used for training. So it's a little difference there. And you're automatically opted out of the training with the API, opted automatically in with ChatGPT. And we were also gone through all the vendor assessment for all the different services. that's why we're starting to move toward running our own privatized models, because we'll have a little bit more control over that data governance. But more to come for sure.
Yeah. And more generally, one of the things that we want to solve within ARC in the future is having some definition within the metadata of the content you create in our system, so that we can, when either we directly, through labs or through features that we build into the core of our products, integrate with those services, we can respect those contracts. Or if you use one of our integration frameworks like IFX or our event system, you can use that metadata to make sure you respect the contract of that content, whether it should be, submitted to those models or not, whether it should be crawled. That's obviously something that's kind of needs to live with the content from the start.
We're getting a couple questions around when these AI tools are ready for beta, how can folks get on to the beta test?
So I think for that, Joey, let's say we need to have a conversation, obviously, with our account management team. And I'd say the first step is for customers who are curious about that to let their account manager know. And, from there, we can figure out the proper path to get folks added in.
Great. I think this might have been answered, but for the sake of covering it, will there be a cost for usage of the Chrome extension, or will we be required to provide our own ChatGPT API key?
During the beta, there won't be a charge, but we're still working on the pricing proposal for that. That would essentially be, and again, because we're not only going to use OpenAI, so if you have that key, we could discuss that, but there's other pieces to it that are running that aren't related to the OpenAI service. So the actual infrastructure powering it and all of that. But eventually, yes, probably a small fee for it, but TBD.
David asks, any chance we'll want to create and develop our own generative AI models at some point, as opposed to using others' AI services like ChatGPT?
That's more the private models. I doubt we're going to build our own LLM, unless we want to, spend a very, very large amount of money for supercomputing usage. But I don't even know if we need that. I think they're pretty solid, and there's enough diversity there in open source versions. We're layering on a privatized fine-tuned model is just as good, really, as building your own LLM.
Yeah. And I think from the ARC XP perspective, there's obviously going to be a lot of players who specialize in this space. Our goal is to make it as easy as possible for customers to leverage these technologies alongside their content with minimal integration effort. So we'll focus on basically, making sure you can plug the content into the correct models, that it's possible to add private models to them, that it's possible to use that content on the sites that ARC powers or alongside our content tools, as opposed to trying to build competing services.
Great. And then someone asked about, are there any security implications? I assume about the tools that we are going to be testing.
Yeah. Joey, let me grab that one if that's okay, just about that.
Yeah,
and so I think the point for that one is we're doing that due diligence now. Any customer use of this will probably be accompanied by some, accompanying contract language that will address specifically how that will get used and what you'd be opting into. In no case with any of these, either labs experiments or core features, we would not be subjecting customers, to it without them sort of opting in, and whatever terms would apply, they'd have to agree to ahead of time.
Great. And then someone asks, is there a method by which we can tap into our own third-party translation services like OpenL, Lionbridge, et cetera? Or is this primarily using the AWS offered solution?
Right now we're not using the AWS offered solution for the extension. It is using OpenAI, and then we'll use other models. But that's why we're, starting to meet with customers individually for the private beta to learn what maybe differences you may want. And that's something we could potentially add in, where you can pass the model for other things, but say we also want to use a different translation model instead, and we could work that out.
Cool. And then Duncan asks about the examples of the charts and graphics created by AI. Is anyone doing this right now?
No, it is a feature we're experimenting with in the extension. Uh, OpenAI can generate images, and we've done some tests with like just putting in basic data, even like in a comet list, and can create a basic chart, but then it doesn't really have maybe your styling to it. So that's something we're looking at to be flexible. But yeah, we're looking at that as well.
But Joey, beyond kind of the labs experiments, I guess the point is, what are some of the models you've seen that you can create semi-convincing, graphics or diagrams out of when you supply kind of input content?
So OpenAI can do it. They announced about a month ago. That's like a specific use case of like basic, almost Excel-like charts, so line charts, bar graphs. And there's forgetting the name of it's popular high charts. High charts JS has created an AI powered version of high charts, where you can like basically there's a JavaScript right out the data generates the chart. Those are two big ones at the moment. But a lot of them can generate charts, but they're really just finding the chart from somewhere else. It's not as good. So like give me a chart of like AI growth in the past 2 years. It's just probably gonna go lift that from like Google Images or something. But yeah, that's coming for us. We're looking at that as well. It would be very helpful.
Yep.
Perfect. And then our last question that we have in the queue, if anyone has any burning questions left, get them in now. Our last question is, how does a potential tech partner, such as a cloud API provider who can help with the internationalization features discussed today, reach out to the team at ArcXP?
Here, Joey, let me grab that one. So obviously some of what we talked about today isn't just what we're doing within the labs or within the product. It's just examples of what customers are building on their own. And so in the case of translations, we don't have an inbuilt product for doing those translations, not today. There's some experiments that Joey can probably talk about after. But actually, I see Michael Schmidt in the chat post about this. We do have a great service as part of Arc called IFX, which is built for sort of on an event basis, triggering external code and potentially posting to an external partner for something like translating of content. And so there's basically some really good platform solutions within ArcXP that you can use to integrate with external providers. You do have to sort of identify and contract with those third-party providers to do the actual translation work. But we've got the integration set so that you can build it on top of Arc without having to do custom hosting yourself. And that's something that between your account manager and our product team, we can talk to any of the customers about and give you sort of the correct advice and solution about how to do it.
Great. All right. And those are all the questions we have. Thank you for everyone who stuck around an extra 5 minutes. Thank you, Matt and Joey, for taking the time to share with everyone today. We got lots of comments in the chat about how this was an exciting presentation, lots of exciting stuff coming, and lots of interest to participate in that beta. So like Matt said, please reach out to your account manager if you're interested in that. Keep an eye on your email for future community webinars. We're glad that you joined us today, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.